The year is 1084, and young King Olaf II was forced to flee his kingdom by neighboring nemesis, King Canute. Olaf mustered all the men he could, even enlisting his 15-year-old half-brother Harald Sigurdsson into his ranks and marched back to his homelands. Unfortunately, scouts had reported his movements back to Canute, and an ambush was planned. The pivotal battle of Stiklestad was about to commence. Canute's forces assembled in the valley and pushed forward. No horns blaring, no commands shouted. The shield wall pushed to the front, providing protection for the archers in the rear. Olaf's forces entered the opposite end of the valley, marching in column formation and completely unaware of the danger that lay ahead. The beating of hoofs could be heard at the top of a nearby hill. It was a small contingent of horse archers. Were they sent to harass or perhaps a scouting party? It was impossible to know. As Olaf turned back to his troops, his stomach sank. The whole valley was covered in blue shields. There was no time to retreat to more favorable ground. The fight was already upon him. All he could do was order his infantry into shield wall and his archers into loose formation. The horns finally blared, men roared, and horses thundered. Canute sent his best troops and cavalry to destroy the enemy's left flank. On the right flank, Harald Sigurdsson fought bravely against the enemy cavalry, narrowly dodging a couch lance, felling the mount, and thrusting his spear into its rider. He returned to his formation and unsheathed his sword. His first strike surprised his enemy, knocking him to the floor, but he was still a boy and lacked the strength to overpower anyone or pierce their armor. Nonetheless, he swung wildly, striking out at everyone in front of him. That is, until he was struck in the head with a Dane axe. His helmet spared his life, but not his consciousness. The battle raged around him, and Olaf's right flank emerged victorious, but his left flank crumbled. His shield wall began to flee back to the safety of his archers. What was left of both shield walls met in the middle for a massive scrum. They pushed back and forth, neither gaining the upper hand on the other. After hours of back and forth fighting, both sides were exhausted and retreated back to safety. However, Olaf's rage could not be contained, and he ordered his troops back on the offensive. Push the advantage while these cowards flee, he said. What he failed to realize was the second half of Canute's men lay in wait beyond the hills they could not see. It was a feigned retreat. As Canute's men reached their own second line, he ordered them to halt and face the enemy. The Reds fought valiantly in the face of certain doom, but they were showered by hostile javelins and spear thrusts. Quickly they fell, their lifeless bodies sliding down the hill. Olaf ordered his reserves forward in a last-ditch effort. It was all or nothing now, but they stood no chance. The ocean of blue quickly engulfed their enemy. Olaf himself was slain, ran through with a spear to the guts, and his throat slit wide open. As the survivors fled the field, one of Harald's closest friends carried him to the mountains. Were it not for Ragnvald Brusason, Harald would have been executed by Canute that day. Many Norwegians and Danes lost their life, but nothing changed. Canute would remain king of the north. Harald had barely escaped the Battle of Stiklestad, owing to the bravery of his friend Ragnvald, who carried him from the field. Harald's half-brother Olaf was slain, and Canute remained the king of Sturgia. With no other options left, Harald fled his homelands and traveled to the kingdom of Kazate, ruled by Yaroslav the Wise. Yaroslav had welcomed Harald and even allowed him to work his lands, clearing bandits and gangs from around his kingdom. But he couldn't get the job done with just two, so he found fellow countrymen who were looking for adventure, like Bjorn. However, life in the steppes is rough, and Bjorn wouldn't even survive his first encounter with an enemy, taking a sword blow down the center of his face. His son, Bjorn II, would later join the group and bring honor back to his father's name. After months of clearing gangs from town, the group set their eyes on a bigger prize, a bounty from a local notable to clear a hideout of steppe bandits. They slowly worked their way through the base, clearing all who stood in opposition. At last, they reached the leader of these professional bandits, who challenged Harald to a duel. While Harald had yet to grow facial hair, he was a savage with his spear and stabbed the man dead with a single thrust through his left eye socket. They survived the ordeal, but more importantly, earned thousands of dinars for it. Roughly 2 years and one full beard later, Harald had finally saved up 100,000 dinars. Having served Yaroslav well for this time, he asked to marry his daughter, but was met with an offer. "Leave my lands and return with fame and fortune, and you may have my daughter's hand in marriage," he said. And so the group set off to the west, to the lands where mercenaries are paid handsomely and blood is spilled frequently. Two important things for a Viking's happiness. They arrived in Zionica and quickly signed a mercenary contract. They were now officially part of the Varangian Guard, an elite group of mercenary troops paid personally from the pockets of the Emperor, Michael IV. His first assignment? To help retake the rebel town of Kuyaz. While they had never sieged a castle before, that didn't stop them from being the first to the walls, easily overwhelming the defenders and slaughtering all who opposed them. War eventually broke out between the Empire and the Sultan of Asarai. Harald was tasked with leading his elite guards to counter the enemy cavalry in an upcoming battle. He had developed an ingenious strategy to counter the lighter, quicker Asarai cavalry, stabbing the enemy mount in the unarmored anus. Easily, the cavalrymen were toppled from their horses, and their heads promptly caved in with a two-handed mace. Harald helped the Emperor to achieve a great victory that day, but Michael would squander it through reckless attacks and opening multiple front wars. After several botched wars and several years later, Michael IV asked Harald to lead a raiding party against the enemy's civilian population. Finally, he thought, a task I'm truly passionate about. Harald masterfully raked the enemy archer line, decimating them and enraging their shield wall to charge headlong. The local commander was sly, and he split his forces in two, trying to envelop Harald's shield wall. Harald fought viciously, striking out at anyone who dared to flank his line. It was a massacre, with only a handful of survivors left to tell the story of how the Varangian guards ruined their lives forever. 6 years had passed since Harald joined the Varangian Guard, under the leadership of Michael IV. His retinue expanded to 24 loyal and battle-hardened Vikings. His dinar balance had likewise expanded, now totaling over 1 million. His family's renown had grown to a level that rivaled kings. He had everything he needed to return to Yaroslav, except one thing. He was still under contract for Michael IV, but then everything changed. The local nobles had been conspiring to overthrow Michael IV for quite some time due to his incompetence, which led to the empire shrinking in half. They stirred discontent among the peasants, who championed Harald to save them from disaster. So Harald seized the opportunity, stormed the palace, and apprehended the emperor. The crowds wanted blood, but Harald didn't want to be known for regicide. So he plucked both of Michael's eyes out with a Pugio and banished him to a monastery, where he would die weeks later. A power vacuum ensued, and Harald used the confusion to slip out of the city with his retinue, his money, and his fame intact. He returned to Yaroslav the Wise weeks later, and the two spoke at lengths about his time in the Varangian Guard. However, the crafty old man wouldn't give up his daughter that easily. In exchange for her hand, Harald would need to spend the next 2 years in the Khuzait lands teaching his men how to counter the Empire's tactics. After all, he had spent 6 years of his life fighting alongside them, learning and developing their every move. And so the marriage took place, the two royal families united at last. Harald was wise for his age and masterfully squeezed every bit of efficiency from these 2 years that he could. He trained his guard to unparalleled heights of martial prowess, crafted custom weapons specifically to counter Canut's army, and continued to mass his wealth. Winter had come and snow blanketed the countryside. Harald's 2-year contract had come to an end. Finally, it was time to set his plans in motion. He would leave Elisaveta behind until he could procure a town worthy of her comfort, along with their 3, soon-to-be 4, children. The group would head north, gather an army, and retake the throne of Sturgia from Canute once and for all.